Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. My name is Francesco and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some long duration signals that we observed at the Lightning Dog geothermal field in New Mexico. This project is rather preliminary, so what this presentation is going to focus on are some very interesting signals and responses that we observe at the field and why they might be of interest. Of course, I want to also introduce my collaborators, Alan Huskar, who is my supervisor here at Caltech, and Joel Edwards, who is the point of contact at Zanskar Geothermal. So the Lightning Dog geothermal field, also known as LDG, is a blind high temperature resource that reaches about 150 degrees C at 1 kilometer's depth. And it's been in production by Circ Energy starting about 2013 and is currently producing about 10 megawatts. And why this field is quite interesting to us is that it has a fantastic seismic array that was deployed for about 3 weeks in 2020. And the original purpose of this array was to better image and assess the controlling fracture networks. But what they also found was some really interesting long period tremor-like signals. And the way we sort of saw this was by visual inspection, which is actually a big component of this presentation. So here you can kind of see the 1200 geophones along with the injection wells in blue and production wells in red, as well as some temperature sensors. This figure shows one of the interesting responses that we see at the field. And what we have here is a 1 hour time segment. We have the time series at the top, and we have spectrograms here at the bottom. And what I would like to sort of draw your attention to is a time period really between 1200 to 2000 seconds. And what we observe are a lot of energy that's sort of in a convex shape, mostly between 20 to 40 hertz, but there's actually quite a few higher harmonics. One of the reasons we started this project was to look for a class of seismic signals called long period, long duration signals. And what these are seismic events that are temporally co-located with hydraulic fracturing, typically in tight gas and shale gas reservoirs. And the current mechanisms driving these signals are a superposition of slow shear slip events on large faults during stimulation. These classes of events are actually of significant interest to both oil and geothermal companies due to the potential for increased field productivity. And the main reason for that is that they have been principally mapped to zones of large natural fracture density. And because we're seeing these signals even farther away than one might expect from stimulation, it can actually tell us a bit about how fracture networks are interconnected. So when we first started this project, the principal question we asked ourselves is, are these signals LPLDs, or are they actually due to some other type of mechanisms? And could we catalog them? Could we figure out if there were different classes of signals and figure out how often they occurred? And then, of course, sort of the very last component, which is perhaps the most important, is can these be located? Of course, you can't really talk about a geothermal field until you talk about the noise that you can get there. And unfortunately, we have quite a bit. So on the right-hand side, you will see sort of the background energy noise. It's actually not too bad. It's about 10 hertz and below. Of course, we have micro earthquakes produced by stimulation, and these tend to be rather thin signals that sort of take up about 150, 200 hertz worth of energy, and these generally are quite manageable. Unfortunately, we also have a high degree of production noise, and this is the machinery that there is at the geothermal field. And unlike sort of the noise that I showed in the previous slide, this noise is a big problem for our methods because, as you can see, it fills the entire spectrum. So if you have any sort of small signal occurring during these time periods, you just will not be able to see it. The first thing we did to tackle this problem was to observe as much data in both the time and frequency domain as we could. And through visual inspection, we broadly narrowed it down to 3 different classes of interesting signals. And here is all 3 of them together, and we're going to go through each one of them in detail. The first class of signal, or type 1 event, is the same type that I showed in the previous slide. So the one with the convex shape. Now it's just taken in a sort of a little bit of an aerial view. And what I also showed here on the top right is an FFT of the signal in blue compared to the FFTs of micro earthquakes and noise. So there's a few things we can say about this. So we can say that these signals are very tremor-like. They're highly emergent, and as we said before, they have most energy between 20 and 80 hertz, but they do have higher harmonics. Looking at the FFT, we can also say that these have approximately the same energy as microseismicity. Now, type 2 event is where things get sort of interesting, where you actually have signals that are a little bit more impulsive than what we saw in type 1. And we have a really interesting feature that goes, you can see it in the spectrogram from about 50 to 100 seconds. And what we see is we see a down-sloping ramp that starts at about 150 hertz and work its way down to about 50 hertz over the course of, maybe 70, 80 seconds. And similar to type 1, we actually have approximately the same energy as microseismicity. So the last type of event that we see is what we think sort of the most unusual one. And as you can see, it's actually a very, very thin slice of energy. It starts from about 100 hertz and goes down to 50 hertz, sort of a little bit like a type 2, but it doesn't have the same wealth of frequencies. Furthermore, instead of just this high concentration, you also have a very distinct upper harmonic between 200 to about 150 hertz. As we might expect from just looking at the spectrogram, in the FFT we can see that compared to microseismicity and noise, this type of signal has a lot more energy in the band of 50 to 100 hertz, but it's not as much for the other frequencies. So what can we say about mechanisms based on the data that we've shown so far? Well, firstly, we can say that the LPLD mechanisms, which again is the superposition of slow shear slip events on faults, is probably not very likely. The main reason for this is that that mechanism does not account for the higher harmonics that we see in our data very clearly. Another mechanism that we're looking at that was proposed by KJ, who's a postdoc here at Caltech as well, is friction-induced inertial vibrations. So that's something that could be possible and we're actively exploring. Another quite possible mechanisms is gas or fluid pressure changes in a conduit. And this is somewhat similar to volcanic tornillo events, but for our case, it'd be quite a bit different because we are observing higher frequencies than is typically observed for tornillo events. And also tornillo events tend to be rather monochromatic. In order to narrow down what possible mechanism could be occurring, we need to catalog these events, figuring out when they occur. So the first thing that we did was a very first order detection algorithm, which was to do cross-correlation template matching. We took one of the type 1 events and we filtered it, as you can see here on this right-hand side, high pass filter above 10 hertz. And we tried to cross-correlate as much as we could with the other data to figure out if this was a possible way that we could at least sort of detect some of these signals. Unfortunately, we found that the detection results were very unreliable due to the high degree of geothermal production noise. So just to remind you, this is the picture again of the geothermal production noise, and you can imagine cross-correlating any sort of signal will get a perfect correlation because the entire spectrum is filled with energy. As previously mentioned, our final objective is to be able to do location analysis, not just detection. So we test the cross-correlation template matching for each instrument for a particularly quiet event and seeing if we can suss something out from the arrival times. When we have all these arrival times, we removed all values that were anomalously low or high and then took a standard deviation of the results and then cut all exceeding values out of the standard deviation. We then took the earliest arrival time and then used it as a reference station. So what we see here in the figure is on the x-axis we have an arrival time, and then on y-axis we have distance from the reference station. Now this reference station is listed as a red scatter point, so everything is relative to that. And when you plot all the arrival times with distance, you can use this to get an average velocity. And for us it was about 100 meters per second. This figure is a move-up plot of the arrival time shown in the previous slide. And so the color scheme is such that the darker blue, it means it's the faster arrival time. And looking at this figure, we can see that the signal that we looked at might be originating from the southwest of the field, but the variation is such that it cannot really be accurately constrained. And the reason that this spread is there is due to the large amount of geothermal production noise in this analysis time. So the same problem that we had for the detection, we have now in this location methodology, which suggests that this cross-correlation template matching as it is may not be an accurate method for this type of analysis. To summarize this very preliminary analysis, what we found is that the geothermal field contains 3 different types of long-duration signals with energy typically between 20 to 8 Hertz. And these signals are associated with stimulation. Now, the signals are approximately the same order of energy as microseismicity, but have different spectral content and waveform characteristics. We developed the very first order location detection assessment using cross-correlation template matching, but found that this methodology could not be used to accurately constrain those parameters due to the geothermal production noise. And of course, what we are aiming to do is to catalog these signals and to try different methodologies that can allow us to observe these parameters while still sort of getting around the problem of geothermal production noise. And that's sort of the 2 main methodologies that we're looking at to try out are machine learning methodologies, particularly deep scattering network and supervised image detection. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and many thanks to Circ Energy for sponsoring this research.